let go of her arm. Brody Whitfield laughed. Then he shoved Nora Bennett to the ground. The quad went silent. String lights swayed overhead. 100 students stood frozen, cider cups still in their hands. Nora cried out, cradling her wrist. And something inside the quiet freshman girl, something she had held shut for 5 long years, finally broke open. She moved. 2 seconds. That was all it took. Brody hit the grass face down, his arm pinned, her knee steady between his shoulder blades. He never even saw it coming. Nobody in that crowd could believe it. The scholarship girl. The one who refills coffee cups at the diner on Main Street. She leaned close to his ear. You do not touch her again. Do you understand me? What none of them knew, not one single person standing in that quad, was who Madison Cole used to be. Or what her mother had taught her.
The town of Wentworth Falls sits quiet most of the year. You could drive right through it and miss it. A diner, a church with a white steeple, a small college with red brick buildings that have stood for over 100 years. Nothing about it looks like the beginning of a story. But every story has to start somewhere small. This one starts with a girl carrying 2 suitcases up the front steps of a dormitory. Her name is Madison Cole. Everyone calls her Maddie. She is 19 years old. She has brown hair pulled back in a simple braid. She wears an old flannel jacket that used to belong to someone else. She does not smile much, not because she is unhappy, because she is careful. Careful is a word that fits Maddie Cole better than any other. She grew up in this town, actually, not far from campus in a small house with a porch light that never quite worked right. Her father died when she was 6 years old, a car accident on a wet road late at night. After that, it was just her and her mother for a long while, her grandfather close by every single step of the way. His name is Frank Cole, 71 years old, a man built like an old oak tree, steady, unshaken by weather. Frank spent 30 years as a police officer in this town. The last 8 of those years, he was the chief. He retired 5 years ago. Now he runs a small self-defense class out of an old gym on Maple Street. Free classes mostly for women and older folks in town who want to feel safe walking to their cars at night. Frank taught Maddie a great deal in those years. Patience, steadiness, how to read a room before it ever turned dangerous. But it was her mother who taught her almost everything else. The things that do not usually come up in ordinary conversation. We will get to that. Frank became her sole guardian later on when Maddie was still a young teenager. That, too, is a story worth telling. We will come back to it before this chapter ends. Right now, all you need to know is this. Maddie Cole is starting her freshman year at Wentworth College. She got a partial scholarship. She works nights at a diner 2 blocks from campus to cover the rest. She keeps to herself. And on this particular morning in the middle of September, she has no idea her life is about to change. Let's step back for a moment. Every story needs a villain. Not always someone evil to the bone, sometimes just someone who has never once in his life been told no. That is Brody Whitfield, 21 years old, a junior, president of the largest fraternity on campus. His father is Richard Whitfield, a real estate developer who has poured more money into Wentworth College than any other donor in the school's history. There is a building on campus with the Whitfield name carved into stone above the door. There will soon be another one. Brody grew up believing the world owed him something. Nobody ever told him otherwise. He is tall, handsome in the way that gets you invited places, charming to teachers, cruel to anyone who cannot fight back. And on this particular morning, he is standing in the courtyard with 3 of his fraternity brothers laughing about something that does not matter. That is where our story begins. Right there in that courtyard under a September sky the color of pale blue glass. Maddie is walking across campus with a tray of food in her hands, her first lunch as a college student. She does not see Brody coming. He is not looking where he is walking. He never does. The world moves out of his way. He bumps into her hard on purpose, though he will later claim it was an accident. The tray flies out of her hands. Food scatters across the pavement. A cup of orange juice splashes across her shoes. For one moment, the courtyard goes quiet. Then Brody laughs. "Watch where you're going," he says, though it was clearly his fault. His friends laugh too. That kind of laugh that comes easy when you know nobody is going to stop you. Maddie kneels down to pick up her tray. Her hands are steady. Her face shows nothing. That is the first thing you should notice about her. When most people get humiliated in public, their face gives them away. Not Maddie's. She has learned somewhere along the way how to be still. Brody watches her for a second, almost disappointed that she is not crying, not yelling, not giving him the reaction he wanted. So he decides to push a little further. He reaches down and grabs her wrist as she picks up the tray. Not hard enough to hurt her, just hard enough to make a point. Her sleeve pulls back. That is when he sees the bracelet. A simple thing, really. Woven fabric faded from years of wear, stitched into the cloth in careful thread are the words, "Patience is not weakness." "What is this?" Brody says, grabbing at it. "Some kind of hippie thing?" "Please let go," Maddie says quietly. Her voice does not shake. Brody smiles. He likes an audience. His friends are watching now. A small crowd of students has stopped to see what is happening. He pulls harder. The old thread snaps. The bracelet comes loose in his hand. For half a second, something flickers across Maddie's face, something that is not fear. Brody does not notice it. He is too busy holding the bracelet up like a trophy. "Nice friendship bracelet," he says, tossing it into a mud puddle near the flower bed. "Looks about as cheap as everything else about you." His friends laugh harder this time. Maddie does not move for a moment. The crowd waits to see what she will do. Some of them are hoping she will cry. Some are hoping she will yell back so this can turn into a real show. Instead, she walks over to the mud puddle. She kneels down. She picks up the bracelet, wipes it gently against her sleeve, and looks at Brody Whitfield with an expression that is somehow calmer than anything he has ever seen. "You have a chance to walk away," she says. "Right now." It is such a strange thing to say. So quiet. So sure of itself. Brody laughs, but there is something underneath the laugh now. A flicker of confusion. "Or what?" he says. Maddie does not answer. She simply picks up her ruined lunch tray, turns and walks away. The crowd does not know what to make of it. Some of them will remember this moment for the rest of their lives, though none of them know that yet. Because sometimes the most important moments in a story do not look important at all. They look like a girl walking away in silence carrying a broken tray and a torn bracelet while a crowd of strangers watches her go. Let's talk about that bracelet for a moment, because it matters more than you think. It belonged to Maddie's mother. Her mother's name was Sarah Cole. Sarah wasn't famous outside of Wentworth Falls, but inside this small town, especially among people over the age of 60, her name still means something. Sarah Cole was a self-defense instructor. She taught women, teenagers, the elderly, anyone who wanted to learn how to protect themselves. She taught for free most of the time, out of the goodness in her. She had a gift, not just for fighting, for teaching people to believe in themselves. There are men and women all over this town now in their 60s and 70s who took Sarah's classes decades ago. Some of them still remember the exact words she used to say. "Patience is not weakness. Courage is quiet more often than it is loud. The strongest people you will ever meet rarely need to raise their voice." Sarah embroidered those words onto small bracelets. She gave one to every student who finished her course. She kept one for herself. The one with the words about patience. When Sarah died, that bracelet went to her daughter. Maddie has worn it every single day since she was 14 years old. Until this morning, when a boy named Brody Whitfield ripped it off her wrist in front of a crowd of strangers and called it cheap. We will come back to Sarah Cole's story. There is more to it than anyone in this tale realizes yet. But for now, let's follow Maddie back to her dorm room. She walks slowly, tray forgotten, in a trash can along the way. Her dorm is a modest brick building near the edge of campus. Room 214. She climbs the stairs, opens the door, and finds her new roommate sitting on the bed by the window. Her name is Nora Bennett. Nora is also 19, also a freshman, also on a scholarship, though hers is for academics rather than need. Nora grew up in a small farming town 2 hours from Wentworth Falls. She is here on a full ride studying to become a veterinarian. She is nervous in the way that new students often are, talkative to fill the silence, quick to smile, quicker to apologize for things that are not her fault. When Maddie walks in, Nora looks up immediately. "Oh my gosh, are you okay?" Nora says, noticing the orange juice stain on Maddie's shoes, the mud on her sleeve. "What happened?" Maddie sits down on her own bed. She holds the broken bracelet in her palm. "Just a bad first day," she says. Nora waits, unsure whether to ask more. Maddie looks at the bracelet for a long moment. "This was my mother's," she says quietly. "Someone broke it." Nora's face falls. "That's terrible. Do you want me to help fix it?" Maddie shakes her head. "It's okay. I'll fix it myself. Later." There is a pause in the room, the kind of pause that happens when two strangers are deciding whether they are going to become friends. Nora breaks it first. "I'm Nora, by the way. I probably should have said that before asking about your shoes." For the first time all day, something close to a smile crosses Maddie's face. "Maddie," she says, "nice to meet you." And just like that, in a small dorm room on a quiet afternoon, something begins. A friendship that neither of them yet understands will matter more than either of them can imagine. That evening, Maddie calls her grandfather. She sits on the small balcony outside her dorm room, phone pressed to her ear, watching the sun go down behind the old clock tower on campus. Frank Cole answers on the second ring the way he always does. "There she is," he says, his voice warm and rough like gravel under a porch light. "How's my girl doing on her first day?" Maddie hesitates. "It was fine," she says. There is a pause. Frank has known his granddaughter for 19 years. He knows the difference between fine and fine. "Maddie," he says gently. "What happened?" She tells him, not all of it, but enough. The tray, the crowd, the bracelet. Frank is quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "He broke your mother's bracelet," Frank finally says. His voice is calm, but there is something underneath it, something old and steady, like a fire banked low but never fully out. "I picked it up," Maddie says. "It's just the thread that broke. I can fix it." "That's not what I asked," Frank says. Maddie closes her eyes. "I didn't do anything, Grandpa," she says. "I just walked away." Another pause. "Good," Frank says finally. Maddie is surprised. "Good. You know what your mother used to tell her students?" Frank says. "The ones who walk into a fight looking for one, they usually find exactly what they're looking for. The ones who walk away with their head held high, they win something bigger." Maddie is quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to be like that anymore, Grandpa," she says softly. "I don't want to be someone who fights." There is real pain in her voice when she says it. More pain than the bracelet or the courtyard or the boy named Brody Whitfield could explain. Frank hears it. He always hears it, even from 2 hours away. "I know, sweetheart," he says. "And you don't have to be. Not unless someone leaves you no other choice." They talk a little longer, about her classes, about the diner job starting Friday, about the weather, which is starting to turn cool, the way it always does in late September in Ohio. Before they hang up, Frank says one more thing. "You hold on to that bracelet," he says, "no matter how broken it looks right now. You hear me? Some things are worth fixing even when they're torn all the way through." Maddie promises she will. After the call ends, she sits alone on the balcony for a while, holding the torn bracelet in her hand, watching the lights come on across campus, one window at a time. She does not know it yet, but somewhere across that same campus, a woman named Diane Hale is grading papers in her office, completely unaware that her quiet life is about to intersect with Maddie Cole's in a way that will matter more than either of them could guess. We will get to that soon, but first let's talk about the days that follow. They are not easy days for Maddie. Word travels fast on a small campus. By the next morning, half the freshman class has heard some version of the courtyard story. Most of the versions are wrong. Some say Maddie tripped over her own feet and Brody was just standing there. Some say she started crying and had to be walked to the nurse's office, which never happened. Brody, for his part, tells the story like it is a joke. A funny little moment where some clumsy scholarship girl spilled her lunch on herself. He does not mention the bracelet. He does not mention the words she said to him. "You have a chance to walk away, right now." Those words have stuck with him more than he wants to admit, though he could not tell you why. There is something about the way she said it, calm, certain, like she already knew how this was going to end and she was simply giving him the chance to avoid it. He tells himself it means nothing. He is Brody Whitfield. Nobody gives him warnings. He gives them. Meanwhile, Maddie settles into a rhythm. Morning classes, afternoon study sessions in the library, evening shifts at the diner 3 nights a week where she wipes down counters and refills coffee cups for truck drivers and retired regulars who tip better than the college kids ever do. The diner is called the Coneflower. It has been open since the 1960s. The booths are cracked red vinyl. The pie case by the register has been the same pie case for as long as anyone in town can remember. The owner, a woman named Ruth Adler, is 68 years old. She hired Maddie the moment she walked in and asked for a job. No questions asked, because Ruth remembers Maddie's mother. Everyone over 60 in this town remembers Maddie's mother. "Sarah Cole taught my daughter how to walk to her car at night without being scared," Ruth told Maddie on her first day. "That woman gave this town something it didn't even know it needed. You've got her eyes, you know that?" Maddie did not know how to respond to that. She still does not most days. But she likes working at the diner. It is quiet, predictable. Nobody there is trying to prove anything. Nora, meanwhile, becomes something Maddie has not had in a long time, a friend. They study together in the library on Tuesday nights. Nora talks about her family's farm, about the goats she raised as a kid, about her dream of opening a veterinary clinic back home someday. Maddie listens more than she talks, but she listens carefully, and Nora notices. "You're a good listener," Nora tells her one night, closing her chemistry textbook. "Most people just wait for their turn to talk. You actually hear what people say." Maddie shrugs. "My grandpa says listening is the most underrated skill a person can have." Smart man. He usually is. There is a comfortable silence between them, the kind that only happens between people who are starting to trust each other. It does not take long, though, before Brody Whitfield's shadow falls across Nora, too. It happens on a Thursday, about 2 weeks into the semester. Nora is walking back from a study group, alone, cutting through the same courtyard where Maddie's tray was knocked to the ground. Brody and 2 of his fraternity brothers are there again, the way they always are, treating the courtyard like it belongs to them. One of Brody's friends, a boy named Tyler, recognizes Nora as Maddie's roommate. "Hey!" Tyler calls out. "You're the one rooming with the diner girl, right? The one who cried over spilled lunch?" Nora stops. Her heart begins to pound. "She didn't cry," Nora says before she can stop herself. "You knocked her tray out of her hands. That's not the same thing." The 3 boys exchange a look. Brody steps closer, that easy, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Careful," he says softly. "Loyalty is cute, but it can get expensive around here." Nora's hands are shaking, but she holds her ground. "That's a weird thing to say," she says. Brody leans in slightly. "You're on scholarship too, right?" he says. "Academic, I think somebody told me. Those are the ones the school actually cares about protecting. The need-based ones, though." He shrugs, letting the sentence trail off, letting the threat hang there, unfinished. Nora feels her stomach drop. She does not know exactly what he means, but she understands the shape of it. A threat wrapped in politeness, the kind rich boys learn to make without ever raising their voice. Before anyone can say anything else, a voice cuts through the courtyard. "Everything all right over here?" It is Maddie. She has just come from her afternoon class, backpack over one shoulder, and she is walking toward them with the same steady, unhurried pace she always has. Brody turns, and something in his posture shifts slightly when he sees her. Not fear, not yet. but something closer to irritation. The way you feel when a mosquito keeps landing near you and refuses to fly away. "Speak of the devil," he says. "We were just talking about you." "I heard," Maddie says. She stops beside Nora. She does not raise her voice. She does not clench her fists. She simply stands there calm as still water and looks at Brody with an expression that makes Tyler take half a step back without quite understanding why. "You should leave her alone," Maddie says. Brody laughs, though it sounds forced this time. "Or what? You gonna spill another tray on me?" Maddie does not smile. She does not blink. "I already told you once," she says. "You had a chance to walk away." There is something in her voice that makes the courtyard go quiet, the way it did 2 weeks earlier, though this time for a different reason. Brody opens his mouth to respond, but no clever comeback arrives. For one strange, unexplainable second, he feels something he has never felt before in his life. He feels small. It passes quickly. He shakes it off, forces the smile back onto his face, mutters something about not having time for this, and walks away with his friends trailing behind him. Nora exhales, hands still trembling. "Thank you," she says. "I don't know what I would have said if you hadn't shown up." Maddie puts a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't owe people like that an explanation," she says. "Ever." They walk back to the dorm together in silence, the late afternoon sun slanting gold across the courtyard behind them. Neither of them notices the woman standing near the library entrance, a stack of essays tucked under one arm, who has just witnessed the entire exchange. Her name is Diane Hale. She is 66 years old. A professor of kinesiology and sports science at Wentworth College, she has taught here for over 20 years. Before that, long before that, she was something else entirely. Diane Hale was once a national-level martial arts competitor. In her 20s, she trained under some of the most respected instructors in the country. She competed for 12 years before an old shoulder injury forced her to retire from competition and move into coaching, then eventually into academics. She still teaches self-defense seminars twice a year on campus, mostly attended by female students worried about walking home alone at night. She has spent her whole life around movement, around the way bodies hold tension, the way trained instinct hides itself inside ordinary gestures. And something about the way Maddie Cole was standing in that courtyard a moment ago caught her attention. It was subtle, almost nothing. The weight distribution, the relaxed shoulders that were not actually relaxed at all but coiled, ready, controlled. The way her feet were positioned, slightly angled, balanced. It is the kind of stance that takes years to build into instinct. The kind of stance that does not come from confidence alone. It comes from training, serious training. Diane watches Maddie and Nora disappear around the corner of the science building, and she finds herself standing very still, papers forgotten under her arm. "Now where," she murmurs to herself, "have I seen that stance before?" She cannot place it yet, not fully. But something in the back of her mind, some old memory from decades ago, has been quietly disturbed. She decides she will keep an eye on the new girl. She has no idea yet how right she is to do so. Let's slow down here for a moment, because there is something important happening beneath the surface of this story, something worth sitting with. Maddie Cole is not simply a quiet girl who happens to be tough. She carries something heavier than most people her age ever have to carry. 5 years ago, when she was 14 years old, Maddie was one of the most promising young martial artists in the entire country. She began training with her mother almost as soon as she could walk. Sarah taught the classes at their small local gym in the evenings, and Maddie was always there sitting quietly in the corner until she was finally old enough to join in herself. By the time she was 10, she was already winning regional competitions. By 13, she had claimed a national junior title. People used to say she had a gift, not just physical skill, though she had plenty of that. She had something rarer. She understood distance, timing, patience in a way that most competitors twice her age never fully grasped. Her mother used to say that Maddie did not fight to win, she fought to understand. But something happened during a national qualifying match 5 years ago that changed everything. Her opponent that day was a girl named Casey Reeves, a close friend from her training gym. Someone Maddie had grown up sparring beside for years. During the final round, in a moment that lasted less than 2 seconds, Maddie landed a strike that was, by every rule of the sport, completely legal. But something went wrong. Casey fell awkwardly, her spine twisted in a way it should not have twisted. She never walked the same way again. It was not Maddie's fault. Every referee, every official, review, every expert who studied the footage afterward confirmed that the strike itself was clean, controlled within the rules of competition. It was simply one of those terrible accidents that occasionally happens in contact sports. The kind of thing no training or caution can fully prevent. But knowing that did nothing to ease what Maddie felt afterward. She was 14 years old, standing in a gymnasium watching her friend being carried away on a stretcher, and something inside her broke that day in a way that is never fully healed. She quit competing within the month. She has not thrown a real strike at another human being since. Her mother, heartbroken but understanding, never pushed her to return. "You don't have to fight to be strong," Sarah told her once, that same difficult year. "Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose peace even when they know how to choose otherwise." Maddie held on to those words like a lifeline, because not long after she said them, Sarah Cole was gone too. A car accident. Late at night on a wet road, brakes that failed without warning. The kind of terrible, ordinary tragedy small towns bury quickly and rarely speak of again. Frank became her guardian that same year when Maddie was still only 14. He never once made her feel like a burden. He simply showed up quietly every single day since, the way he always has. Maddie still holds on to her mother's words now 5 years later, in a dorm room 2 hours from the little house where she grew up. This is why Maddie did not fight back in the courtyard. This is why she will not fight back no matter how far Brody Whitfield decides to push her. She is not afraid of him. She is afraid of herself. Afraid of what happens if the door she closed 5 years ago ever opens again. That is the quiet tragedy sitting underneath this whole story, and it is worth remembering as we move forward, because everything that happens next only makes sense once you understand what Maddie is truly protecting. Not her pride, her peace. Now back to the days moving forward. The weeks continue to pass. September fades into the first cool edges of October. Brody Whitfield does not forget the courtyard. He does not forget the words Maddie said to him or the strange, small feeling of being made to feel insignificant by a girl who works nights at a diner. Pride, when wounded quietly instead of loudly, has a way of festering. Brody begins a slow campaign, not of physical confrontation, but of something crueler in its own way. Whispers, rumors, small cruelties dressed up as jokes. He tells people Maddie is unstable, that she threatened him in the courtyard, that she has some kind of anger problem hidden underneath that quiet exterior. None of it is true, but truth has never mattered much to people who are used to being believed, no matter what they say. Some students start to whisper when Maddie walks by. A few of her classmates grow distant, unsure what to believe. Ruth Adler at the diner notices Maddie coming in one evening looking more tired than usual and asks her about it gently. "People talk," Maddie says simply, wiping down a table that does not need wiping. "People always talk," Ruth says. "The good ones outlast the noise. Your mother taught me that too, actually." Maddie looks up. "She taught you that?" Ruth smiles, a little sad around the edges. "She taught most of us something, one way or another." Maddie does not press further. She rarely does. But something about the way people in this town speak of her mother with such quiet reverence, such lasting gratitude, makes her wonder sometimes just how much of her mother's story she truly knows. She does not yet realize how much she is about to find out. Meanwhile, across campus, Professor Diane Hale cannot stop thinking about that stance in the courtyard. She finds herself watching for Maddie between classes, not in a strange way, simply with the quiet curiosity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that will not leave her alone. She notices small things, The way Maddie moves through crowded hallways, always aware of exits, always positioned so her back is never fully to a door, the way she carries her weight low and centered, even while doing something as ordinary as carrying a backpack. These are not accidents. These are habits built by years of discipline. One afternoon in early October, Diane finally gets her chance. She is walking across the quad after her last class of the day when she sees Maddie sitting alone on a bench eating a sandwich between shifts, the torn bracelet visible on her wrist, now carefully mended with new thread. Diane approaches, offering a warm, unassuming smile. "Mind if I sit?" she asks. Maddie looks up slightly, surprised. Professors do not usually sit with freshmen on quiet benches. "Sure," Maddie says. Diane sits down, setting her bag beside her. "I'm Professor Hale," she says. "I teach kinesiology. I don't think we've met." "Maddie Cole," Maddie says. "I haven't taken any of your classes yet." "I know," Diane says. "I've just been meaning to introduce myself." There is a brief, comfortable silence. "That's a lovely bracelet," Diane says after a moment, nodding toward Maddie's wrist. "Looks like it's been fixed recently." Maddie's hand instinctively moves to cover it. "It was my mother's," she says. "It's beautiful work," Diane says gently. "Whoever mended it did a careful job." "My grandfather did it," Maddie says. "He's not much for sewing, but he wanted to try." Diane smiles at that. There is something so tender in the image, an old, weathered man carefully threading a needle to mend his granddaughter's broken bracelet. They talk for a few more minutes, small conversation about classes, about the diner where Maddie works, about the quiet beauty of a Wentworth Falls autumn. But as their conversation winds down, Diane decides to ask the question that has been sitting in the back of her mind for weeks. "Can I ask you something a little unusual?" she says. Maddie tilts her head. "Sure." "Have you ever studied any kind of martial art?" Diane asks. "There's just something about the way you carry yourself I couldn't help but notice." For a moment, something flickers across Maddie's face, something quick, guarded, almost afraid. "No," Maddie says. "Nothing like that." The lie comes out smooth, practiced, the way lies do when you have told them to yourself so many times they start to feel almost true. Diane studies her for a moment, but does not push. "My mistake," she says gently. "Just an old habit of mine. I used to compete years ago. You start noticing things in people." Maddie's eyes flicker with something unreadable. "You competed?" she asks. "National level for over a decade," Diane says. "It's part of why I ended up teaching kinesiology, actually." Old injuries have a way of redirecting a person's life. Maddie is quiet for a long moment. There is something in Diane's voice, something in the calm, steady way she speaks about her past that feels strangely familiar. "I should get to my shift," Maddie says, finally standing up. "Of course," Diane says. "It was nice meeting you, Maddie." "You too," Maddie says. As Maddie walks away, backpack over one shoulder, Diane watches her go, noting once again the subtle balance in her stride, the quiet control in every step. She does not know the full truth yet, not even close, but she knows one thing for certain now. That girl has trained. Trained, seriously trained, for years, under someone who understood far more than the basics. And whatever happened to make her deny it so quickly, so instinctively, is a story worth understanding. Diane Hale decides quietly that she will keep watching, not out of suspicion, out of something closer to recognition. The way you feel when you meet someone who has walked a road you once walked yourself, even if neither of you says so out loud. As October deepens, the leaves along Wentworth's old brick pathways begin to turn amber and gold. The town settles into its familiar autumn rhythm. Football games on Friday nights, church bake sales on Sunday mornings, the smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys after dark. But beneath that peaceful surface, tension continues to build. Brody Whitfield's father, Richard Whitfield, arrives in town for a weekend visit in mid-October, and his presence sends a ripple of anxiety through the administration offices of Wentworth College. Richard Whitfield is not a man who visits quietly. He meets with the college president, He tours the site of a new athletic complex under construction, a building that will soon bear his family's name, funded by a donation large enough to make even a modest college like Wentworth feel indebted for a generation. The land for that complex used to hold a set of older dormitory buildings, the ones that housed most of the school's need-based scholarship students. Those students, Nora among them, were relocated at the start of the semester to make room for construction. Nobody at the college dares to say much publicly about the relocation, but quietly some students and faculty have started to whisper questions. Questions about why the land was chosen. Questions about how quickly the decision was made. Questions about whether proper process was followed at all. Richard Whitfield does not concern himself with whispers. He believes, as his son does, that money settles most disagreements before they ever need to become arguments. During his visit, Richard has dinner with Brody at a restaurant just off campus. Over steak and wine, Brody complains about a girl who embarrassed him in front of his friends. A scholarship girl. Someone who works at a diner and thinks she can talk to him like an equal? Richard listens, mostly amused. "You let a diner waitress get under your skin," he says, chuckling. "She's not just anybody," Brody mutters. "There's something about her I don't know. It's annoying." Richard shrugs, waving the comment away like smoke. "People like that need reminding sometimes," he says. Reminding of where they stand. You come from something, Brody. Never forget that. And never let someone who comes from nothing make you feel small. It is a small conversation, a throwaway moment over an expensive dinner, but it plants something dangerous in Brody's mind. Permission, disguised as fatherly advice. 2 nights later, that permission finds its target. It is a Thursday evening. Maddie is finishing her shift at the diner, tying her apron off, saying goodnight to Ruth, stepping out into the cool October air. She begins walking the familiar path back toward campus, the streetlights just beginning to flicker on above her. She does not notice at first the pickup truck idling near the corner of the parking lot. Brody is behind the wheel, 2 of his fraternity brothers beside him, all 3 of them a little too loud, a little too loose, the particular kind of confidence that comes from a few beers and an evening with nothing better to do. "There she is," Tyler says, spotting Maddie through the windshield. "Diner girl." Brody's jaw tightens slightly. He pulls the truck slowly along the curb beside her, rolling down the window. "Hey," he calls out. "Working late tonight?" Maddie does not stop walking. "Go home, Brody." "Come on," he says, his voice edged with something colder than his usual mockery. "We're just talking." She keeps walking. He keeps pace beside her, the truck creeping along the empty street. "You know," Brody continues, "my dad's building a whole new complex on this campus. You know what used to be there? The dorms where your little friend Nora used to live. Funny how things get moved around when the right people decide they should." Maddie stops walking. She turns to look at him, something sharp and quiet flickering behind her eyes. "What did you say?" Brody smiles, satisfied to finally get a reaction. "I said things get moved when the right people decide they should," he repeats, slowly, savoring each word. "People like you and your little roommate. You're just guests here. Don't forget that." The street is empty. The only sound is the low rumble of the truck's engine and the distant hum of crickets somewhere beyond the streetlights. Maddie stands very still. For the first time since the semester began, something inside her feels genuinely close to breaking. Not fear. Something closer to fury, banked low and controlled the way a fire smolders beneath ash long after the flames have been put out. She thinks of her mother's words. Patience is not weakness. She thinks of the promise she made to herself 5 years ago, standing in a gymnasium beside a stretcher, swearing she would never let this feeling win again. She takes a breath. "You don't know anything about me," she says quietly, "or my roommate, or this town." Brody leans out the window slightly. "I know enough." "You have a chance," Maddie says, her voice low and steady, "to drive away right now." Something about the way she says it, the same words from the courtyard weeks earlier, sends an unexpected chill down Brody's spine, though he would never admit it out loud. For a brief moment, the two fraternity brothers beside him exchange an uneasy glance, but Brody, fueled by pride and his father's careless words from 2 nights before, does not take the warning. He laughs instead, a short hollow sound, and speeds off into the night, tires briefly screeching against the pavement. Maddie stands alone on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching the taillights disappear around the corner. Her hands are shaking just slightly, though not from fear. She looks down at the bracelet on her wrist, the careful stitching her grandfather redid with such patient, clumsy love. Patience is not weakness. She whispers the words to herself like a prayer, like an anchor, and slowly the shaking in her hands begins to still. She does not tell Nora what happened that night. She does not tell her grandfather either, not yet. But something has shifted inside her. A line has been drawn quietly, invisibly, somewhere in the dark of that empty street. She does not yet know how soon that line will be crossed, but it will be. And when it is, everything this small town believes it knows about Madison Cole is about to change forever. For now, though, the story rests here. A girl walking home alone under a darkening October sky. A torn bracelet mended with careful thread. A secret past waiting quietly beneath the surface like a seed buried just deep enough to survive the coming frost. Somewhere across town, an old man sits on his porch sharpening a pocket knife, out of habit rather than need, feeling an unexplainable unease settle over him as the night grows colder. Somewhere on campus, a professor lies awake turning over the memory of a subtle stance in a sunlit courtyard, certain she has seen it somewhere before, though she cannot yet place where. And somewhere in a quiet dorm room, 2 young women fall asleep, unaware that the ground beneath their small, ordinary lives is about to shift in ways neither of them could ever have imagined. Let's linger a moment longer before we close this chapter, because there is one more piece of this night worth telling. After Maddie finally makes it back to her dorm, she does not go inside right away. She sits on the front steps instead, coat pulled tight around her, watching her own breath curl into the cold October air. She thinks about her mother. She thinks about the gymnasium in Columbus 5 years ago, the squeak of sneakers on polished wood, the sound a body makes when it lands wrong. She thinks about Casey Reeves, who used to laugh so easily, who now gets around in a wheelchair most days, though she has never once blamed Maddie for it. That is the strange cruelty of guilt. It does not care what the facts say. It does not care what the referees ruled, or what the doctors explained, or what Casey herself has said over and over in letters Maddie still keeps in a shoebox under her bed. It was not your fault, Maddie. Please stop punishing yourself for something that was never your fault to carry. Maddie has read that letter more times than she could count. She still has not managed to believe it. She thinks, too, about the months right after her mother died, about the strange, aching quiet of that little house on the edge of town, about the students who came by anyway, grown men and women in their 50s and 60s sitting at the kitchen table with Frank and Maddie sharing old stories, thanking a woman who was no longer there to hear it, thanking her instead through the daughter she left behind. You taught me I was stronger than I thought. You gave me my life back. Maddie remembers being confused by it as a teenager, confused by how much her mother's small, unglamorous work had rippled outward into so many lives she had never fully understood. She understands it a little better now, sitting on these cold steps, thinking about a boy in a truck who threatened to erase her friend's home like it was nothing at all. She thinks about what her mother would say if she were here. Not about fighting. Her mother rarely talked about fighting, not really. She talked about protecting. There is a difference, Maddie. A fighter wants to win. A protector simply refuses to let something wrong keep happening in front of them. Maddie sits with that thought for a long while, the cold biting gently at her fingers, the porch light above her flickering the way porch lights in old towns tend to do. Eventually, she goes inside. Nora is already asleep, textbook still open on her chest, lamp still on beside her bed. Maddie quietly turns off the lamp, closes the book, and sets it on the desk. She looks at her roommate for a moment. 19 years old. far from home, trusting this town and this school to keep her safe simply because that is what schools are supposed to do. Maddie feels something settle inside her chest. Not fear anymore. Something steadier. Something closer to resolve. She climbs into her own bed, but sleep does not come easily. She keeps thinking about the words Brody said. Things get moved when the right people decide they should. She keeps thinking about the bracelet on her wrist and the mother who wore one just like it every single day of her working life, teaching people half her age and twice her age that quiet strength is still strength. Somewhere deep in the night, long after the campus has gone dark and the last porch lights of Wentworth Falls have flickered out one by one, Maddie finally drifts off to sleep. She does not dream of the courtyard or the truck or Brody Whitfield's cold, careless words. She dreams of a gymnasium from years ago, sunlight through high windows, her mother's voice calling out corrections from the sideline, patient and warm. Lead with your calm, not your fists, sweetheart. The calm will always get there first. Morning comes softly over Wentworth Falls the way it always does in early autumn, mist rising off the football field. Church bells marking the hour from somewhere near downtown. Life on campus continues, ordinary and unaware. Students hurry to 8 o'clock classes with coffee cups in hand. Professor Hale grades papers in her office, still turning over the puzzle of a girl's unusual stance. Frank Cole opens his gym on Maple Street and sweeps the floor out of habit, the way he has every morning for 5 years, unaware of the phone call he will receive from his granddaughter later that week, a call that will change the shape of everything that follows. And somewhere across town, in a house far too large for one man and his ambitions, Richard Whitfield signs another document, moving forward with plans for a building that sits on land with a history he has never bothered to ask about. None of them know yet what is coming, but something has shifted in this small, quiet town. Something that began with a torn bracelet in a courtyard and a girl who chose silence over anger, patience over pride. It is a small beginning. The kind that rarely announces itself, but every story that ends in truth being spoken out loud has to begin somewhere quiet like this. This is where we leave part 1 of our story. But this, dear friends, is only the beginning. There is a particular kind of morning that follows a night like the one Maddie had, the kind where the sun comes up too bright, too ordinary, as if nothing happened at all. Maddie wakes before her alarm. She lies still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to Nora's slow, even breathing from the bed across the room. She thinks about the truck, about the words Brody said. Things get moved when the right people decide they should. She gets up, quietly careful not to wake Nora, and steps out into the hallway to make a phone call. Frank answers on the first ring this time. He has always been an early riser, old habit from 30 years on the force. "Morning, sweetheart," he says. "You're up early." "Grandpa," Maddie says, "can we talk?" Something in her voice makes Frank sit up a little straighter, though she cannot see that through the phone. "Always," he says. "What's going on?" She tells him everything. The truck, Brody, the threat about the dormitories, the strange cold satisfaction in his voice when he said it. Frank is quiet for a long moment after she finishes. "He said that about the dorms being moved?" "Word for word," Maddie says. Frank exhales slowly. "That's not just a rich kid running his mouth, Maddie. That sounds like a boy repeating something he heard from his father." "What do you mean?" Frank hesitates. Maddie can hear it, that particular pause he takes when he is deciding how much to say. "There's history in this town," Frank finally says. "History with the Whitfield name. Your mother knew some of it. I never told you all of it myself because I wasn't sure how much good it would do you to carry. But maybe it's time." Maddie's chest tightens. "Grandpa, what are you talking about?" Frank takes a breath. "Your mother," he says slowly, "found some paperwork the same year everything happened with Casey. Old land records. Deeds that didn't add up right, going back almost 30 years. Tied to property near the edge of campus. The same land, near as I can tell, that they're building that new sports complex on now. Maddie sits down hard on the hallway bench phone pressed tight against her ear. That was 5 years ago, she says slowly. The same year Mom died. 3 months after she found it, Frank says quietly. That's not a coincidence I've ever been comfortable with. The hallway feels very cold all of a sudden. What kind of paperwork? Maddie finally asks. I don't know all the details, Frank admits. Your mother didn't tell me everything. She was careful about it, said she didn't want to drag me into something before she understood it herself, but I remember she was upset about it for weeks, made some phone calls, talked to a lawyer friend of hers in Columbus. And then what happened? Frank is quiet again. And then she was gone, he says softly. Brakes failed on a wet road late at night. Same kind of accident that took your father all those years before that. The police report was clean both times, no sign of tampering either time, just 2 terrible, ordinary tragedies 8 years apart on roads that see maybe 1 accident a decade. Grandpa, Maddie whispers, are you saying it wasn't an accident? I'm not saying that, Frank says quickly. I don't have proof of anything. I think this town is a way of protecting the people who write the biggest checks, and I think your mother found something that made some very powerful people uncomfortable right before she died. That's all I can honestly tell you. But I think it's worth finding out exactly what that something was before the Whitfield family builds another monument to themselves on top of it. Maddie sits in silence for a long moment, the early morning light spilling weak and gray through the hallway windows. What do we do? She finally asks. We start slow, Frank says. We start careful. I still know a few people in this town who owe me favors, and I think it's time I paid a visit to an old friend of your mother's. Who? Walt Higgins, Frank says. Works security on your campus now, actually. Used to be my sergeant back when I was chief. He looked into your mother's case a little off the books back when things first started looking strange. Never had enough to go on. Maybe now we do. Maddie feels something stir inside her, not fear this time, something closer to purpose. I want to help, she says. I know you do, Frank says, but Maddie, listen to me carefully. You keep your head down for now. You let me and Walt do the digging. You focus on protecting your friend and protecting yourself. Can you promise me that? Maddie hesitates only a moment. I promise, she says. But even as she says it, she is not entirely sure she means it. Let's step away from that phone call for a moment and meet Walt Higgins properly, because he matters a great deal to where this story is headed. Walt is 68 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of quiet, watchful eyes that come from decades of noticing things other people miss. He spent 26 years as a sergeant on the Wentworth Falls police force, most of those years working directly under Frank Cole. When he retired, he took a job as a night security guard on the Wentworth College campus, mostly because sitting at home made him restless, and because he liked the idea of keeping an eye on young people trying to find their way in the world. He remembers Sarah Cole well. Everyone of his generation in this town does. Sarah taught his late wife self-defense classes years ago after a frightening incident in a grocery store parking lot left her shaken for months. Walt watched his wife walk taller after those classes, watched her fear slowly transform into quiet confidence. He never forgot that. When Sarah Cole died and the case landed briefly, unofficially on his desk, something about it never sat right with him. The brakes on her car had been serviced only 2 weeks prior at a shop Walt personally trusted. The mechanics swore up and down that everything had been in perfect working order. But there was no formal investigation, no push from higher up to look deeper, just a quiet, tragic accident filed away and forgotten. Walt kept a small file of his own notes about it anyway, tucked away in a drawer at home, old habit from decades of trusting his gut over paperwork. He never told anyone about that file, until Frank Cole calls him 3 days after Maddie's conversation with her grandfather and asks to meet. They meet at a small coffee shop off Main Street early on a Sunday morning before the church crowds arrive. Walt listens quietly as Frank explains what Maddie told him. The truck? The threat? The strange remark about dormitories being moved when the right people decide they should? When Frank finishes, Walt sits back in his chair for a long moment, saying nothing. "I kept a file," he finally says, "on Sarah. Never told anybody, didn't have enough to take anywhere official, and I didn't want to stir up grief for no good reason if I was wrong."
Frank leans forward. "What's in it?"
"Old land transfer records," Walt says. "The ones Sarah was asking around about before she passed. I managed to get copies from a clerk friend of mine at the county office back when I was still trying to understand what she'd found. There's a gap in the ownership history, about 28 years back. Property changed hands twice in 1 year, cheap, quiet, no public record of why. The land they're building the new sports complex on," Frank says slowly. Walt nods. "Same parcel. Whitfield's company bought it originally under a shell name. Took me weeks just to trace that much." Frank sits back, absorbing this. "You think somebody found out Sarah was digging into this," he says, "and decided to make sure she stopped?"
Walt's jaw tightens.
"I think it's possible. I never had enough to prove it, still don't. But if that boy is out there repeating things about land and dormitories getting moved, sounds to me like his father's still sitting on secrets he doesn't want dug up." The two old friends sit in silence for a moment, the weight of decades settling between them. 12 days, Walt finally says. Frank looks up. "What?" "Founders Day," Walt says. "They're unveiling the new complex during the ceremony. Whitfield's flying in some state senator for the ribbon cutting. Whole town's going to be watching." Frank's eyes narrow. "Then that's our deadline," he says quietly. "Whatever we're going to find, we need to find it before then." Neither of them says it out loud, but they are both thinking the same thing. If there is any truth buried in this land, buried alongside whatever Sarah Cole discovered 5 years ago, it needs to come out into the light before that ribbon gets cut, before the story gets sealed away for good beneath a shiny new building bearing the Whitfield name. 4 days later, Walt manages to track down someone he has not spoken to in nearly a decade. A woman named Evelyn Marsh, 73 years old, who worked for over 20 years as a clerk in the county records office before retiring. Evelyn was the one who first flagged the strange gap in the land ownership history all those years ago, back when Sarah Cole first came asking questions. Walt finds her living in a small house on the edge of town tending a garden of chrysanthemums that have somehow survived the first frost. "I wondered if someone would ever come asking again," Evelyn says, setting down her trowel, wiping her hands on her apron. "I always figured that girl's questions got her into more trouble than she bargained for." She invites Walt inside for coffee, and over the next hour she tells him everything she remembers. The land in question, nearly 30 acres near the edge of what is now Wentworth College, was originally owned by a farming family named the Colliers. In the early years, before either Frank or Walt were even born, the Colliers sold off small parcels here and there to support the farm. But 28 years ago, the entire remaining parcel changed hands twice within the same calendar year. First to a shell company registered out of Columbus, then almost immediately after to a development firm that buried 3 layers deep in its ownership structure traced back to Richard Whitfield's father. The sale price was almost nothing, Evelyn says. Half what similar land was going for at the time. I always wondered how that got approved without anybody batting an eye. "You think somebody paid to make sure nobody batted an eye?" Walt says. Evelyn shrugs, though her eyes say more than her shoulders do. "I couldn't prove anything," she says. "Just paperwork that didn't add up and enough years working that office to know when a deal smells wrong. Sarah Cole came to me asking the same questions you're asking now. I gave her copies of what I had, told her to be careful." "Did she say who she was planning to bring it to?" Walt asks. Evelyn nods slowly. "A reporter, I believe. Somebody from a paper over in Columbus. She never got the chance to follow through, from what I understood." Walt sits with that for a long moment, an old ache settling behind his ribs. "Would you be willing to say all this again?" he asks carefully. "If it came to that. Officially, I mean." Evelyn studies him for a moment, then nods. "I'm 73 years old, Walt," she says. "I've got nothing left to lose by telling the truth. I probably should have said more of it 5 years ago." Walt thanks her, gathers copies of the records she still keeps carefully filed away in a cedar box in her hallway closet, and drives straight to Frank's gym on Maple Street. The two old friends spend that evening spreading papers across a folding table, piecing together a timeline that, while still far from complete, paints an increasingly troubling picture.
We need more than old paperwork and one retired clerk's memory, Frank says, finally rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. We need something that ties this directly to what happened to Sarah. Walt checks the calendar hanging on the wall of Frank's gym. 8 days now remain until Founders Day. We've got 8 days, Walt says. Frank looks up, jaw tight. Then we'd better move fast. Meanwhile, back on campus, life continues in its ordinary rhythm, though beneath the surface, small cracks are beginning to show. Nora, still shaken by her encounter with Brody's friends in the courtyard weeks earlier, has grown quieter than usual. She still smiles. She still laughs at Maddie's dry, occasional jokes, but there is a new wariness in the way she moves through campus now, a habit of glancing over her shoulder that was not there before. One evening, while Maddie is at her diner shift, Nora decides to clean their small dorm room, mostly to distract herself from an upcoming exam she is nervous about. She starts with Maddie's side of the room, folding a stray sweater, straightening a stack of textbooks. That is when she finds the shoebox. It is tucked beneath Maddie's bed, half hidden behind a suitcase. Nora almost does not notice it at all, except that her cleaning cloth catches the edge of the lid, sliding it slightly open. She should not look. She knows she should not look, but curiosity, especially the gentle, well-meaning kind, has a way of winning arguments with good manners. Inside the box, she finds old photographs. A girl, clearly Maddie, though younger, maybe 13 or 14, standing on a podium in a martial arts uniform, a medal around her neck. Beneath the photographs, folded carefully, a newspaper clipping. Local teen claims national junior championship title. The article includes a photo of Maddie, mid-competition, captured in a powerful, controlled stance, an opponent falling backward in the frame. Beneath that, a small stack of letters, the handwriting rounded and careful, clearly written by someone young. Nora does not read them. She does not need to. The return address alone, a rehabilitation center 2 states over, tells her enough. Nora sits on the floor stunned, staring at the clipping for a long moment. She thinks of Maddie's calm, quiet presence in the courtyard weeks ago. The way she stood so still, so unshaken in front of Brody and his friends. The way she once told Nora, almost offhandedly, that her grandfather taught her a little bit about defending herself growing up. A little bit. Nora carefully places everything back exactly as she found it, closes the shoebox, and slides it back beneath the bed. She does not know what to do with what she has just learned. When Maddie comes home from her shift later that night, tired, smelling faintly of coffee and fried onions, Nora is sitting cross-legged on her bed, waiting. "Hey," Maddie says, hanging her jacket by the door. "You're up late." Nora hesitates only a moment before speaking. "Maddie," she says softly, "can I ask you something?" Something in her tone makes Maddie pause. "Sure," Maddie says slowly. "I wasn't snooping, I promise," Nora says quickly. "I was just cleaning and I saw something under your bed, and I know it's none of my business, but I can't stop thinking about it." Maddie's stomach drops. She already knows. "The shoebox," she says quietly. Nora nods. For a long moment, neither of them says anything. Maddie sits down slowly on the edge of her own bed, staring at her hands. "I used to compete," she finally says. "Martial arts. Started when I was little. My mom trained me herself." "You were a national champion," Nora says softly. Maddie's jaw tightens. "For a little while." "What happened?" Maddie is quiet for a long time, long enough that Nora almost apologizes and lets the subject drop. But then Maddie starts to speak slowly, carefully, the way someone speaks when they are opening a door they have kept shut for a very long time. She tells Nora about Casey Reeves, about the final match 5 years ago, about the strike that was completely legal, completely within the rules, and the terrible accident that followed anyway. She tells her about the wheelchair,
about the guilt that never fully left, no matter how many times Casey herself insisted it was not Maddie's fault. She tells her that her mother died that same year, only a few months later, and that some days she still cannot tell which loss she is grieving when the grief comes for her. She tells her that she has not thrown a real strike at another person since. By the time she finishes, Nora's eyes are wet with tears. "Maddie," she says softly, "that wasn't your fault. Either of those things." "That's what everyone says," Maddie replies, voice barely above a whisper. "Doesn't make it easier to believe." Nora reaches over and takes her roommate's hand. "I won't tell anyone," she says. "I promise. Not Brody, not anyone. This stays between us." Maddie squeezes her hand gently, grateful beyond words. "Thank you," she whispers. They sit together in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have just crossed some invisible threshold into deeper trust. Outside their window, the campus lights flicker on one by one against the darkening October sky, and somewhere far beneath the surface of this quiet, ordinary night, the countdown toward Founders Day continues ticking steadily forward, one day at a time, toward whatever is waiting on the other side of it. Let's check in now on Professor Diane Hale, because she has not been idle these past weeks either. Ever since her conversation with Maddie on the quad, Diane has found herself unable to fully set aside her curiosity. She spends several evenings in her office, pulling up old competition archives online, searching through footage from national junior championships spanning the past decade, looking for that particular stance, that particular balance burned into her memory from decades of watching bodies move. It takes her nearly 2 weeks, but she finally finds it. An old video, grainy, uploaded years ago by some amateur videographer covering a regional qualifier. A young girl, barely a teenager, moving through a match with a kind of precision and patience far beyond her years. The caption beneath the video reads simply, "Madison Cole, age 13, regional finals." Diane watches the footage several times, her hands pressed against her mouth. There it is. The exact stance, the exact balance, the same quiet, coiled readiness she noticed in the courtyard weeks ago. She leans back in her chair, staring at the frozen image on her screen, memories stirring from decades earlier. Diane herself trained for years under a small, tightly knit lineage of instructors, a lineage that traces back through only a handful of teachers across the country. She recognizes now, with startling clarity, the specific style Maddie was trained in. It is the same lineage, the very same careful, patient philosophy of movement that once belonged to a woman Diane competed alongside decades ago, before that woman retired from competition to become a teacher herself. A woman named Sarah Cole. Diane sits very still for a long moment, connecting pieces she had never thought to connect before. She had heard vaguely, years ago, that Sarah Cole had passed away. She had never realized until this very moment that the quiet freshman she had been watching on campus was Sarah's own daughter. Diane closes her laptop slowly, her mind racing. She decides right then that it is time to reach out properly. Not as a curious professor anymore, but as someone who might genuinely be able to help. The next morning, she sends a short, careful email to Maddie, asking if she might have a few minutes to talk sometime this week, mentioning gently that she believes she may have known Maddie's mother many years ago. Maddie reads the email 3 times before responding. Her hands tremble slightly as she types back a simple reply. "Yes, I'd like that." They agree to meet the following afternoon in Diane's small book-lined office on the 2nd floor of the athletics building. When Maddie arrives, Diane welcomes her warmly, offering a cup of tea from an old kettle she keeps on a side table. "I found some old footage," Diane says gently once they are both seated. "From a regional final years ago." I recognized the stance immediately. It took me a while to place why it looked so familiar. Maddie's shoulders tense slightly. "I told you I hadn't trained." "I know what you told me," Diane says, not unkindly. "I understand why. But Maddie, I think I knew your mother. Sarah Cole, right?" Maddie's eyes widen slightly. "You knew her?" "We competed against each other more than once back in the day," Diane says.
She was one of the most remarkable athletes I ever faced, not just for her skill, for the way she carried herself. Win or lose, she always left the mat with more grace than anyone else in the building. Tears well up unexpectedly in Maddie's eyes.
I didn't know that, she whispers. Diane reaches across the desk, gently placing a hand over Maddie's. There's a lot about your mother's life you probably don't know, she says softly. She touched more people than you realize, Maddie, in ways both big and small. They talk for over an hour that afternoon, Diane sharing old memories of competitions decades past, of watching Sarah teach seminars with such patient, quiet wisdom that even seasoned competitors found themselves humbled. By the end of their conversation, Maddie feels something inside her chest loosen slightly. Some old, tightly wound tension beginning just barely to ease. Before she leaves, Diane says one more thing. Whatever happened, whatever made you set this part of yourself aside, she says gently, I just want you to know if you ever need someone in your corner, I'm here. No pressure, no expectations, just someone who understood your mother and who would like to understand her daughter too. Maddie nods, throat too tight to speak, and leaves the office that afternoon carrying something she has not felt in a very long time. Something close to hope. But hope in this story is about to be tested. Let's follow one more thread before the story reaches its breaking point, because Brody does not confine his frustration to campus alone. 3 days after the coffee shop meeting, with pressure from his father mounting, Brody pays a visit to the Coneflower Diner, arriving just before Maddie's evening shift begins, timing it deliberately so Ruth Adler will be behind the counter alone. He orders coffee he has no intention of drinking, and waits until Ruth approaches to refill his cup before speaking. I hear you've got Madison Cole working here, he says casually. Ruth eyes him carefully. She has run this diner for over 20 years. She knows trouble when it walks through her door wearing an expensive jacket. She's one of my best girls, Ruth says evenly. Why do you ask? No reason, Brody says, sipping his coffee. Just curious. My father's donated a fair amount to this town over the years. Roads, the new library wing, that grant program the college uses for local businesses. Be a shame if certain businesses stopped qualifying for that kind of support on account of employing troublesome people. Ruth sets down the coffee pot slowly, her expression hardening. Are you threatening my diner, son? I'm just making conversation, Brody says, smiling thinly. Ruth leans forward slightly, resting both hands on the counter. Let me tell you something, she says, voice low and steady. I've been serving coffee in this town since before your daddy ever set foot here. Sarah Cole taught my daughter how to defend herself outside a bar one Friday night, and because of that, my daughter came home safe instead of becoming a statistic. So you can take your father's money and his threats, and you can understand right now that this diner will keep employing Madison Cole for as long as she wants to work here, come hell or high water. Brody's smile falters slightly. He is not used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone he considers beneath him. He leaves without finishing his coffee, but the encounter does nothing to cool his temper. If anything, it adds fuel to a fire that is already burning dangerously close to the surface. Ruth calls Maddie that evening before her shift, just to let her know what happened, gently, carefully, the way you tell someone bad news you want them prepared for rather than blindsided by. I'm not worried about him, Ruth says firmly. You just keep your head up, sweetheart. This town remembers who takes care of who. Maddie thanks her, hangs up the phone, and sits for a long moment on the edge of her bed, feeling the walls slowly closing in from every direction. The rumors, the threats, now this. She thinks about calling her grandfather again, but decides against it. He has enough on his plate already chasing down old land records with Walt. Instead, she goes for a walk that evening alone, along the quiet edge of campus near the old chapel, trying to clear her head before her shift. She does not know it yet, but 2 days later, at the autumn festival in the Quad, all of this carefully building pressure, hers, Brody's, and the entire town's, is about to collide in a single, unforgettable moment. The days tick forward. 9 days before Founders Day, then 8, then 7. Brody grows increasingly frustrated. His rumors about Maddie have not stuck the way he hoped. If anything, more students have started quietly taking her side, unsettled by the strange cruelty of his campaign against a girl who did nothing more than pick up a bracelet from the mud. His father calls twice that week, pressing him about unrelated matters, mentioning offhandedly that the Founders' Day ceremony needs to go perfectly, that certain members of the board have been asking uncomfortable questions about the history of the construction site, and that any disruption, any embarrassment at all, would reflect poorly on the family name. Brody does not fully understand what his father means by uncomfortable questions. He does not care to ask. But the pressure sits on him anyway, tightening his temper, shortening his patience, until finally, 7 days before Founders' Day, everything comes to a head. It happens on a Wednesday evening during a campus-wide event in the main quad, a small autumn festival organized by the student council, complete with food trucks, string lights, and a local band playing softly near the fountain. Maddie and Nora attend together, enjoying a rare, ordinary evening among friends, laughing over cups of warm cider, watching younger students toss beanbags at a carnival-style game near the edge of the crowd. Brody arrives later in the evening, already irritated from another tense phone call with his father, drink in hand, looking for any excuse to release the pressure building inside him. He spots Nora first, laughing near the cider stand, and something in him snaps. He crosses the quad quickly, shoving through the crowd, and grabs Nora roughly by the arm. "You think you can just spread rumors about me?" he snaps, voice loud enough to draw attention from the surrounding crowd. "Telling people I threatened your little scholarship houses." Nora's face goes pale. "I never said anything like that." "Don't lie to me," Brody snaps, gripping her arm tighter. "Let go of her," Maddie says, stepping forward, immediately her voice sharp and clear. Brody turns toward her, eyes wild with frustration that has nothing really to do with either of these girls and everything to do with a father who has never once made him feel like enough. "Stay out of this," he snaps. "Let go of her arm." Maddie repeats, steady, unwavering. Instead, in a moment of pure, careless anger, Brody shoves Nora backward, hard, releasing her arm all at once. Nora stumbles, loses her footing on the uneven cobblestone path, and falls, hard, her head narrowly missing the sharp edge of a nearby stone planter, her wrist twisting awkwardly beneath her as she catches herself against the pavement. The crowd gasps. For half a second, the entire quad seems to freeze, string lights swaying gently overhead, the band's music trailing off into stunned silence. Nora cries out in pain, cradling her wrist against her chest, tears springing instantly to her eyes. And something inside Maddie, something she has spent 5 long years carefully, painfully holding closed, breaks open all at once. She does not think. She does not hesitate. She moves. Brody, still riding the reckless momentum of his own anger, steps toward Nora again, perhaps to grab her once more, perhaps simply too far gone in his fury to notice what is happening around him. He never reaches her. Maddie closes the distance between them in the space of a single breath, her body moving with a fluid, controlled precision that feels to everyone watching almost impossible to comprehend from someone they have only ever seen calmly refilling coffee cups at a diner. She catches his outstretched arm, redirects his own momentum against him, and in one smooth, decisive motion brings him down onto the grass beside the fountain, pinning his arm firmly but carefully behind his back, her knee planted with exact, controlled pressure between his shoulder blades. It happens in less than 2 seconds. Brody hits the ground with a stunned grunt, more shocked than hurt, his face pressed sideways against the cool autumn grass. The quad falls utterly silent. Dozens of students stand frozen, cider cups forgotten in their hands, phones half raised before anyone quite remembers to actually record what they are witnessing. Maddie holds the position for exactly as long as necessary, no longer, her voice low and steady as she speaks directly into Brody's ear. "You do not touch her again," she says. "Do you understand me?" Brody, humiliated, furious, and more than a little frightened, manages only a strangled, "Get off me!" Maddie releases him, immediately stepping back with the same calm, controlled grace she carried into the movement. She does not gloat. She does not smile. She simply turns away from him and kneels quickly beside Nora, checking her wrist with careful, practiced hands. "Can you move your fingers?" she asks softly. Nora, still shaking, nods through her tears, wiggling her fingers slowly. "I think it's just sprain. We need to get you to the health center," Maddie says gently, helping her to her feet. Around them, the crowd remains frozen, staring, whispering, phones now fully raised, capturing the aftermath of a moment none of them will soon forget. Brody climbs slowly to his feet, brushing grass and dirt from his jacket, his face flushed with humiliation and rage in equal measure. "You're done," he snarls at Maddie, pointing a shaking finger toward her. "You're finished at this school. My father will make sure of it." Maddie does not even look at him. She is focused entirely on Nora, gently guiding her through the stunned crowd toward the health center. But Diane Hale, standing near the edge of the quad, having witnessed the entire sequence unfold in stunned professional awe, watches Maddie disappear into the night with an expression somewhere between pride and quiet dread. Because Diane recognizes something else in that brief, precise movement, beyond simply the skill. She recognizes restraint. Extraordinary, deliberate restraint. A level of control that could have easily caused Brody serious injury had Maddie wanted it to. She did not want it to. She simply wanted him stopped. Diane understands in that moment exactly what kind of young woman Maddie Cole truly is. But she also understands something more troubling. Word of what just happened will spread across this campus by morning, twisted and exaggerated in a dozen different directions. And Richard Whitfield, a man already anxious about uncomfortable questions surrounding his new construction site, is not going to let his son's public humiliation go unanswered. 7 days remain before Founders Day. At the campus health center, a nurse wraps Nora's wrist in a soft brace, confirming it is only a sprain, nothing broken, though she will need to keep it wrapped for a couple of weeks. Nora sits on the edge of the exam table, still a little pale, watching Maddie pace quietly near the door. "You didn't have to do that," Nora says softly. "You could have gotten in serious trouble." Maddie stops pacing and looks at her. "You were on the ground," she says simply. "There wasn't a version of that moment where I stood still." Nora manages a small, watery smile. "I've never seen anything like that in my whole life. I hope you never have to again," Maddie says quietly. They sit together in silence for a while, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only sound in the small room, until the nurse returns with discharge paperwork and a small orange bottle of pain relievers. When they finally leave the health center, the campus outside feels different somehow. Quieter, but charged, the way air feels heavy right before a storm breaks. Maddie walks Nora back to their dorm, gets her settled into bed with a cup of tea and an ice pack, and then steps out into the hallway to make one more phone call before the night is through. Frank answers groggily, well past his usual bedtime. "Maddie, everything all right?" she tells him. All of it, the shove, the fall, which she did in response. There is a long silence on the other end of the line. "Grandpa," she says softly, "are you upset with me?" "No, sweetheart," Frank says, his voice thick with something that sounds almost like relief. "No, I'm not upset. I've spent 5 years watching you carry a weight that was never fully yours to carry. Tonight you protected your friend. That's not the same thing as what happened before. Your mother would tell you the exact same thing if she were here." Maddie closes her eyes, tears finally slipping free, the ones she has been holding back since the moment Nora hit the ground. "I was so scared," she whispers, "not of him, of myself, of what it would feel like to let that door open again." "And how did it feel?" Frank asks gently. Maddie thinks about it for a long moment. "Controlled," she finally says. "Like I was standing right at the edge and I chose exactly how far to go, instead of letting the fear choose for me." "That's the difference, sweetheart," Frank says softly. "That's the whole difference. Your mother spent her life trying to teach people. Discipline isn't about never using what you know. It's about only ever using exactly as much as the moment requires, and not 1 ounce more." They talk a little longer until Maddie's breathing steadies, until the tears finally slow. "Get some sleep if you can,"
Frank adds gently. Tomorrow's going to ask a lot of you one way or another. I will, Maddie says. Good night, Grandpa. Good night, sweetheart. I love you. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you're becoming, even on the hard nights, especially on the hard nights. Maddie sits with that for a long moment after they hang up, phone still warm in her hand, the hallway quiet around her. Before they hang up, Frank grows quiet for a moment. Maddie, he says carefully, Brody said his father would make sure you're finished at that school. I need you to hear me on this. Whatever happens next, whatever gets said or threatened, you are not alone in this. Walt and I are close to something. I can feel it. You just hold your ground a little longer. I will, Maddie promises. Meanwhile, across town, in a house built far larger than any single family could ever need, Richard Whitfield's phone rings just past midnight. He answers irritably, expecting some minor construction delay, some contractor calling with an excuse. Instead, it is Brody, his voice tight with humiliation and fury, recounting a version of the evening's events that paints himself as the innocent victim of an unstable, dangerous scholarship student. Richard listens in silence, his jaw tightening with every word. She attacked me in front of half the school, Brody says. People are already posting videos online. This is going to make us look terrible right before Founders Day. Richard is quiet for a long moment, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead the way it always does, calculating angles, considering leverage, searching for the fastest path back to control. Don't say anything else to anyone tonight, Richard finally says. Not the school, not your friends, not the police, if anyone asks. I'll handle this in the morning. He hangs up the phone and sits alone in his dark study for a long while, staring out the window toward the distant lights of the college campus, glowing faintly against the night sky. A girl named Madison Cole has just become a problem he did not anticipate. And Richard Whitfield does not like problems he did not anticipate, especially not 7 days before the biggest night of his family's public legacy. He picks up the phone again, this time dialing a different number entirely, one belonging to a member of the college's board of trustees, a man who has, over the years, grown quite comfortable depending on Whitfield's generosity. Whatever conversation follows behind that closed study door, it does not bode well for the days ahead. By morning, just as Diane Hale predicted, the story has already spread far beyond the quad. Shaky phone footage circulates through group chats and social media accounts across campus. The video capturing only the final 2 seconds of the encounter, Maddie's controlled takedown, looking out of context far more dramatic and far more dangerous than it actually was. Some students defend her fiercely, having witnessed firsthand what led up to that moment. Others, hearing only secondhand rumors, begin to whisper that the quiet diner girl from freshman year has some kind of hidden violent streak. Ruth Adler hears about it before Maddie even arrives for her Thursday shift, one of the regular customers, showing her the video on his phone over breakfast. Ruth studies the grainy footage for a long moment, then hands the phone back with a small, knowing nod. Looks to me like she did exactly what needed doing, Ruth says simply, and not one bit more. Diane Hale, for her part, spends the morning fielding quiet questions from a few concerned colleagues who saw the video, carefully steering every conversation away from speculation and back towards simple facts. A student was shoved. Another student intervened to stop it. Nothing more needs to be said, at least not yet, not until Diane fully understands what she witnessed herself. She finds herself, more than once that morning, staring out her office window toward the dormitory where Maddie lives, wondering how much longer this quiet, careful young woman can hold together a secret that clearly wants more and more with each passing day to come out into the light. Meanwhile, in the president's office on the far side of campus, a very different kind of conversation is already underway. By 10 o'clock that morning, Vice President Whitcomb has already received 2 phone calls, one from a visibly agitated Richard Whitfield and another from a trustee board member, gently suggesting that perhaps, given the delicate timing so close to Founders Day, the situation with the scholarship student who was involved in yesterday's incident ought to be handled quietly and swiftly. Whitcomb,
A careful, cautious administrator who has spent the better part of his career avoiding conflict wherever possible agrees to look into the matter personally. He does not yet know the full truth of what happened in that quad. He does not know about Sarah Cole, or the land records Frank and Walt have been quietly piecing together, or the old buried history connecting the Whitfield family fortune to a stretch of land that once belonged to a family named the Colliers. All he knows is that a large donor is unhappy, and that unhappy donors, in his experience, have a way of becoming very expensive problems if left unaddressed. He picks up his office phone and asks his assistant to schedule a disciplinary meeting for early the following week, one that will require Madison Cole's attendance. None of them, not Whitcomb, not Richard Whitfield, not even Brody himself, fully understand yet just how much is quietly working its way toward the surface, gathering slowly, patiently, the way water gathers behind a dam that has stood far too long. Against pressure, it was never truly built to hold. 7 days remain before Founder's Day, and every single one of them is about to matter more than anyone in Wentworth Falls could possibly imagine. Let's close this chapter here, on that quiet, stunned quad, string lights swaying gently overhead. A crowd of witnesses beginning to whisper the same question to one another over and over, unable to fully believe what their own eyes just showed them. Who exactly is Madison Cole? The answer, dear friends, is coming, but not yet. Not until the truth finally has nowhere left to hide. 7 days can feel like nothing at all, or they can feel like an entire lifetime, depending on what is riding on the other side of them. For Maddie Cole, this particular week feels like both at once. It begins, though nobody realizes it yet, with a visit Brody pays to the campus health center the very morning after the festival. He tells the nurse on duty that his wrist has been aching since the night before, that he thinks something might be sprained. The nurse examines it carefully, finds only mild tenderness, nothing swollen, nothing bruised, in any way that matches a serious injury. She notes as much in his file. But a note in a file worded carefully enough can be made to say more than it actually means. By that afternoon, Brody has filed a formal complaint with the dean of students describing the quad incident as an unprovoked attack, claiming Maddie struck him without warning, exaggerating the wrist tenderness into what his complaint calls a possible sprain requiring further evaluation. He leaves out entirely the part where he shoved Nora to the ground first. His father's attorney reviews the complaint before it is even submitted, tightening the language, making sure it reads as serious as it possibly can without technically crossing into an outright lie. It is, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of dishonesty the Whitfield family has always specialized in. Not bold enough to be easily disproven, just misleading enough to do its damage before anyone has the chance to look closely. The disciplinary meeting Vice President Whitcomb scheduled arrives on a gray Monday morning, rain tapping softly against the tall windows of the administration building. Maddie sits in a hard wooden chair across from a long table, Whitcomb on one side, a school attorney on the other, a folder of paperwork between them that seems to Maddie far thicker than it has any right to be. Miss Cole. Whitcomb begins folding his hands carefully on the table. We take incidents involving physical altercations very seriously here at Wentworth. We've also received a formal complaint from Mr. Whitfield alleging you struck him without provocation and that he sustained a wrist injury as a result. Maddie stares at him momentarily, too stunned to speak. That's not what happened, she finally says. He shoved my roommate to the ground. I stopped him from doing it again. That's all that happened. There is footage, Whitcomb says, sliding a printed still frame across the table, one carefully chosen moment from the video. Brody, face down in the grass, Maddie's knee against his back. Footage that, alongside a formal medical complaint, looks quite serious. Then look at the whole video, not one frame of it, Maddie says. Ask anyone who was standing there. Ask the nurse how bad his wrist actually was. Whitcomb glances briefly at the attorney beside him before continuing. We understand there may be more to the story, he says carefully, But given the sensitivity of the situation and given certain concerns raised by members of our board, we've decided a short suspension is appropriate while the matter is fully reviewed. Maddie's stomach drops. A suspension? Based on a complaint from the person who started it? It's a formality, Whitcomb says, though his eyes do not quite meet hers when he says it. 1 week. You'll be reinstated shortly after. 1 week. Maddie does the math instantly in her head. 1 week from today lands exactly on Founder's Day. She understands, in that moment, with a clarity that settles cold and heavy in her chest, that this has nothing to do with formalities at all. She is quiet on her walk back to the dorm that afternoon, rain soaking through her jacket, her mind turning over every angle of what just happened. By the time she reaches her room, Ruth has already called twice. Maddie sits on her bed and finally returns the call, bracing herself. "Sweetheart," Ruth says gently, "I need you to know this isn't me. The grant committee called this morning, said if I don't make some staffing changes before the ceremony, they're pulling next year's funding for the diner. I fought them as hard as I could." Maddie closes her eyes. "You don't have to explain, Ruth." "I do," Ruth says, her voice tight with anger and helplessness in equal measure. "Because it's wrong, and I hate that I can't fix it faster than they can hurt you. You'll have your job back the second this settles. I promise you that." Maddie thanks her, softly hangs up the phone and sits alone in the quiet of her dorm room, the weight of the entire week pressing down on her all at once. School, work, both gone, at least for now. Both taken not because she did anything wrong, but because telling the truth in this town at this particular moment has become inconvenient for the wrong people. This, dear friends, is what the story calls the false victory. The moment when everything a person has worked for seems to collapse all at once, when doing the right thing appears on the surface to have cost far more than it was ever worth. It rarely stays that way. But it always, always feels like the end right before it isn't. Nora finds Maddie sitting quietly on the edge of her bed that evening, staring at nothing in particular, the torn and carefully mended bracelet turning slowly between her fingers. "Hey," Nora says softly, sitting down beside her. "I heard about the suspension." "News travels fast," Maddie says, a tired half-smile touching her lips. "For what it's worth," Nora says, "half the freshman class is furious about it. People saw what actually happened, Maddie. They know the truth." "The truth doesn't seem to matter much around here right now," Maddie says quietly. Nora is quiet for a moment, then reaches over and takes her friend's hand. "It will," she says firmly. "It always does, eventually. My grandmother used to tell me that lies are fast, but the truth is patient. It always catches up in the end." Maddie looks at her, something warm flickering behind the tiredness in her eyes. "Your grandmother sounds like she would have liked my mother," she says softly. "I think she would have too," Nora says, squeezing her hand. They sit together for a while longer, the small dorm room settling into a comfortable quiet, until Nora finally speaks again, more hesitant this time. "Can I ask you something?" she says. "About the suspension. Are you scared?" Maddie considers the question honestly before answering. "A little," she admits. "Mostly I'm just tired of feeling like doing the right thing keeps costing more than it should." "For what it's worth," Nora says, "I don't think it's going to stay that way. I have this feeling ever since your grandfather started asking around town that something bigger is coming. Something that's going to make all of this make sense." Maddie manages a small, tired smile. "I hope you're right." "I usually am," Nora says, with just enough playful confidence to draw a real laugh out of her roommate for the first time in days. They stay up a little longer than they should, talking about nothing important, about Nora's chemistry final, about whether the diner's pumpkin pie recipe changes for the holidays. Ordinary conversation that feels, on a week like this one, like its own small act of defiance. Eventually, Nora falls asleep first, as she usually does, and Maddie lies awake a while longer, listening to the old radiator ticking in the corner, the bracelet still turning slowly between her fingers, even in the dark. Across town that same evening, Frank Cole receives a phone call of his own, one that changes the entire shape of the week ahead. It is Walt, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Frank," he says, "you need to come down to the security office now. I found something." Frank drives straight over, meeting Walt in the small cluttered back room of the campus security building, monitors lining one wall, old file boxes stacked in the corner. Walt gestures him toward a chair in front of an ancient desktop computer. "You remember I told you the county clerk's office had those old land records?" Walt says. "Well, turns out that's not the only thing I've been sitting on all these years." "What do you mean?" Frank asks. Walt pulls up a folder on the screen, a series of old digital video files, dates stamped in the corner, going back nearly 2 years. "Back before the college upgraded their security system," Walt explains, "there was an older backup server running parallel to the main one for about 2 years before it got decommissioned. Nobody remembered it existed except me because I was the one who helped install it. I kept the old hard drive when they replaced the system, told myself I'd get around to properly disposing of it. Never did." Frank's eyes widened slightly. "What's on it?" "About 2 years of miscellaneous campus footage," Walt says, "most of it useless, but I started digging through it last night, cross-referencing dates, and Frank, I found something. Footage from a night about 1.5 years ago involving Brody Whitfield and a young woman named Ashley Turner." Frank leans forward. "Who's Ashley Turner?" Walt's expression darkens. "A sophomore who used to go here," he says. "Withdrew from the college suddenly right in the middle of last spring's semester. Officially, records say personal reasons. But I remember there were whispers at the time, quiet ones, about some kind of incident. Nothing ever came of it publicly." He clicks play on the footage. The video, grainy and slightly distant, shows a poorly lit parking lot near one of the older dormitories, time-stamped just after midnight. 2 figures are visible near a parked car. One is unmistakably Brody Whitfield. The footage shows an altercation. Brody grabbing the young woman's arm, forcefully pushing her against the car, the woman clearly struggling, clearly frightened, before eventually breaking free and running toward the dormitory entrance. Frank watches in grim silence until the footage ends. "Was there ever a report filed?" he asks quietly. "There was," Walt says. "I found reference to it buried in an old campus security log, but the official report on file now doesn't match what I remember reading back then. Seems the details got quietly softened somewhere along the way." Ashley withdrew from school less than 2 weeks later. Full tuition refund, according to the financial records I managed to pull. More money than any refund policy at this school would normally allow. Frank sits back slowly, the pieces settling into place with a heaviness that makes his chest tighten. "They paid her to leave quietly," he says. "That's my read on it too," Walt says. "Same pattern as what we found with the land, near as I can tell. Money moving quietly to keep uncomfortable truths from ever seeing daylight." Frank rubs a hand across his face, exhaling slowly. "We need to find Ashley Turner," he says, "and we need to find her fast." 6 days remain before Founders Day. It takes Frank and Walt 2 full days to track Ashley Turner down, working every old contact and favor they have between them. They eventually locate her living with her parents in a small town about 90 minutes away, working part-time at a bookstore while she considers whether to return to school somewhere else entirely. Frank makes the drive himself, alone, understanding that this conversation needs a gentler touch than a phone call from a stranger could offer. Ashley is guarded at first when Frank introduces himself on her parents' front porch, understandably wary of a strange man showing up asking about the worst night of her life. But when Frank explains who he is when he mentions Sarah Cole's name, something shifts in her expression. "Sarah Cole taught a self-defense workshop I went to my freshman year," Ashley says quietly, "before everything happened. I always wished I'd taken more from that class than I did." Frank sits with her on the porch for nearly 2 hours, gently explaining what he and Walt have uncovered, showing her, with her permission, the footage Walt recovered. Ashley watches the video in silence, tears slizzing down her cheeks, old wounds clearly reopening with painful clarity. "They told me if I made a formal complaint, it would become my word against his," she says softly. "That the school couldn't guarantee how it would go for me.
that it would probably follow me for the rest of my life no matter what happened. My parents just wanted it over with. So did I, honestly. I understand, Frank says gently, and I want you to know nobody is asking you to relive that night for anyone else's benefit but your own peace of mind. But there's a young woman back at that school right now, Sarah's daughter, actually, who is about to lose everything she's worked for protecting someone else from the exact same kind of person who hurt you. Ashley is quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. Sarah's daughter, she finally says softly. I didn't know she had a daughter at Wentworth. She does, Frank says, and she's got her mother's whole heart in her, whether she believes that about herself yet or not. Ashley looks up, something resolving behind her eyes. What do you need from me? She asks. Frank explains carefully, gently, making sure she understands every step, every possible consequence before she agrees to anything. By the time he leaves that evening, Ashley has agreed to provide a written statement, and if she feels strong enough by then to appear in person at Founders Day. Frank drives home through the darkening countryside, feeling for the first time in over a week something close to real hope. 4 days remain before Founders Day. Meanwhile, Diane Hale has been busy in her own quiet way. Word of Maddie's suspension has reached her, along with growing unease across the faculty about how quickly, how quietly the decision was made. Diane requests a private meeting with the president of the college, a soft-spoken but principled woman named Dr. Eleanor Bird, who has led Wentworth for the past 6 years. Diane lays out everything she knows. The footage from the quad, the character and restraint Maddie displayed, her own suspicion now growing stronger by the day, that outside pressure rather than genuine policy drove the suspension decision. Dr. Bird listens carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. I was not fully informed of the circumstances surrounding this decision, she admits finally. Whitcomb handled it independently, citing donor sensitivities ahead of Founders Day. I should have asked more questions before allowing that. There's more, Eleanor, Diane says quietly. I believe there may be a connection between this family's construction project and some serious buried history involving land fraud and possibly worse. Dr. Bird's face pales slightly. That's a serious accusation. I know, Diane says, which is why I'm not asking you to act on my word alone. I'm asking you to keep an open mind and perhaps delay any final disciplinary ruling until after Founders Day so the full truth has room to surface properly. Dr. Bird considers this for a long moment, then nods slowly. I can agree to that much, she says. It is a small victory, but an important one. The suspension stands for now, but no permanent expulsion decision will be finalized before the truth has its chance to reach the light. 3 days remain before Founders Day. Let's pause here for a moment because there is one more visit worth telling you about before we reach the night that changes everything. Frank makes one final call that week to a woman he has not spoken with directly in over 4 years, though her name has echoed through this entire story from its very first pages. Casey Reeves. She is 19 years old now, the same age as Maddie, living with her family about 2 hours from Wentworth Falls, having spent the past 5 years slowly rebuilding a life that once revolved entirely around competition, around movement, around a sport that in one single unfortunate moment took something from her. She is still learning to live without. She uses a wheelchair most days now, though she has regained partial use of her legs through years of careful physical therapy, enough to stand and take a few steps with support when she needs to. She has never once in 5 years blamed Maddie for what happened, but she has also never had the chance to say that to Maddie's face, not properly. Not since that terrible spring 5 years ago when they lost each other in the same handful of months, first to an accident on a competition mat, and then, not long after, to a death. Neither of them ever got the chance to properly grieve together. Frank explains everything to her gently over the phone. Maddie's suspension, the Whitfield family's history, what Founders Day represents, and what it might take to finally set things right both for the town of Wentworth Falls and perhaps, in some small way, for the 2 young women whose lives were forever tied together by one impossible moment 5 years ago. Casey listens quietly, then speaks with a steadiness that surprises even herself. "I've wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault for 5 years," she says softly. "Maybe it's time I finally got the chance." She agrees to come. 2 days remain before Founder's Day. The night before Founder's Day in the Whitfield family's sprawling home, Brody sits across from his father in the study, nursing a drink he is technically too young to have poured himself, though nobody in that house has ever cared much about such details. "Tomorrow needs to go perfectly," Richard says, not looking up from the papers spread across his desk. "No more incidents, no more scholarship girls making scenes." "She's not going to be there," Brody mutters. "She's suspended, remember?" "Good," Richard says simply. Brody hesitates, turning his glass slowly in his hands. "Dad," he says, "that video from the parking lot, the one with Ashley. You don't think anyone still has that, do you?" Richard finally looks up, his expression unreadable. "That situation was handled a long time ago," he says. "Paid, settled, filed away. There's nothing left to find." "But what if there was?" Brody presses. "What if somebody—" "Then we would handle it," Richard cuts in sharply. "The same way we handle everything. Quietly and quickly, before it ever becomes anyone else's problem to gossip about." Brody falls silent, staring down into his glass, something uneasy sitting heavy in his chest that he cannot quite name. He has spent his whole life believing his father could fix anything, smooth over anything, make any inconvenient truth simply disappear before it ever had the chance to matter. For the first time, sitting in that quiet study the night before Founder's Day, some small, buried part of him wonders what happens when a problem finally grows too large, too public, too deeply rooted in truth for even his father's money to make it vanish. He does not know it yet, but he is about to find out in front of the entire town in less than 24 hours. The morning of the ceremony arrives, crisp and golden, the kind of perfect autumn day that seems almost cruelly too beautiful for the storm quietly building beneath its surface. Wentworth's main quad has been transformed for the occasion. Rows of white folding chairs face a newly constructed stage, a massive banner stretched behind it reading in bold, gleaming letters, "The Whitfield Family Athletic Complex, dedicated to excellence." A red ribbon stretches across the entrance of the gleaming new building, waiting for the ceremonial cutting. Local news vans have already begun setting up along the edge of the quad. A state senator's black car pulls slowly into a reserved parking space near the stage. Richard Whitfield moves through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, accepting compliments, his son Brody trailing beside him in a crisp new suit, jaw set, still visibly uncomfortable from the humiliation of the quad incident days earlier. Maddie watches all of this unfold from the edge of the crowd, standing quietly beside her grandfather Nora on her other side, her wrist still wrapped in its soft brace. She was not sure until this very morning whether she would even attend, but Frank insisted, gently but firmly, that she needed to be here. "Whatever happens today," he told her over breakfast, "you deserve to see it happen, not from a distance, not through someone else's account of it. You've earned the right to stand right here and watch the truth finally get its turn." So here she stands, heart pounding beneath a calm exterior, watching Richard Whitfield step up to the podium as the ceremony begins. Diane Hale stands nearby as well, along with Walt, both of them watching the growing crowd with quiet, careful attention. And scattered throughout the folding chairs, unnoticed by anyone on stage, sit dozens of older men and women quietly gathering in small clusters, exchanging knowing glances, having each received over the past 2 days a simple, heartfelt phone call from Frank Cole himself. Richard Whitfield begins his speech with practiced charm, thanking the college, praising the community, speaking eloquently about legacy and opportunity and the importance of investing in the next generation. The crowd applauds politely. The senator nods approvingly from his seat of honor. Everything is proceeding exactly as Richard Whitfield planned. Until it isn't. As Richard reaches the closing portion of his remarks, preparing to invite the senator up for the ribbon cutting, a soft commotion begins near the back of the crowd. An elderly woman, easily in her 70s, rises slowly from her folding chair, leaning on a cane,
and begins making her way toward the small aisle between the rows. Richard pauses at the podium, slightly thrown by the interruption, watching as the woman reaches the front and speaks in a clear, steady voice that carries easily across the quiet quad. "Mr. Whitfield," she says, "before you cut that ribbon, I wonder if the good people gathered here might like to hear a little bit about the land your building is standing on." A ripple of confusion moves through the crowd. Richard forces a tight smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this really isn't the appropriate moment for—" "My name is Evelyn Marsh," the woman continues undeterred. "I spent 22 years working in this county's records office, and I believe there are some old land transfer documents your family might be surprised to learn are still very much on file." Murmurs ripple through the crowd. Richard's smile falters completely now, his eyes darting briefly toward the security detail standing near the edge of the stage. A third voice rises from the crowd before he can continue. A woman near the middle rows, silver-haired, leaning on the arm of her husband as she stands. "My name is Patricia Novak," she says, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. 31 years ago, Sarah Cole taught a class at the community center for women who'd just come out of difficult marriages. I was one of them. She never once made any of us feel broken for needing that class. She made us feel like we already had the strength inside us, and she was just helping us find it. She pauses, looking directly at Richard. "I don't know everything about land deeds and shell companies," Patricia continues, "but I know enough to recognize a family that spent 30 years building a legacy on top of something they never wanted anybody to look at too closely. And I think it's long past time somebody did." Beside her, an elderly man in a faded veteran's cap adds his own voice, quieter, but no less firm. "I'll say this plain," he offers. "This town gave the Whitfield name, buildings, roads, a library wing, more gratitude than most families ever earn in 3 lifetimes. Seems to me, the least this family owes us back is the truth." Richard Whitfield's face has gone pale, his composure cracking visibly under the mounting pressure of dozens of steady, unwavering eyes. "This is completely unfounded," he says sharply into the microphone. "I won't stand here and be slandered at my own event." That is when Walt Higgins steps forward from the side of the stage, a laptop tucked under one arm, and speaks calmly but firmly into a second microphone set up near the podium for the ceremony's photographer. "With respect, Mr. Whitfield, Walt says nobody's slandering anybody. We've simply got some documentation we think this community deserves to see before that ribbon gets cut on land with a history nobody's ever been honest about." The senator, visibly uncomfortable now, glances toward his aides, clearly reconsidering his position on the stage. Dr. Eleanor Bird, standing near the front row, quietly signals for the large screen beside the stage, originally intended to display photographs from the ceremony, to, instead, display whatever Walt is about to show. A hush falls over the entire quad as the screen flickers to life. First, the old land documents Evelyn provided, displayed clearly for everyone to see. The shell company, the suspiciously low sale price, the buried connection to Richard Whitfield's father. Then, without warning, the grainy security footage from the old backup server begins to play. Brody Whitfield, captured in stark, undeniable clarity, grabbing Ashley Turner's arm in that dimly lit parking lot over a year and a half ago. Brody, standing near his father on the stage, goes rigid with horror, his face draining of all color. "Turn that off," he says weakly. "That's not what it looks like." But before anyone can respond, a young woman rises from a wheelchair near the front row, supported gently on either side by her parents, and speaks in a clear, trembling voice that somehow carries across the entire silent quad. "It's exactly what it looks like," Ashley Turner says. "I was there." The crowd gasps audibly. Phones rise once again throughout the audience, this time capturing every second with steady, unwavering attention. Ashley continues, her voice growing steadier with each word, describing that terrible night. The fear, the way the school quietly paid her to disappear rather than face the truth publicly. By the time she finishes, tears are streaming down the faces of more than a few people in the crowd, including quite visibly Dr. Bird herself, standing rigid with barely controlled fury near the front row. And then, In the stunned silence that follows, one more figure moves slowly toward the front of the crowd. A young woman, 19 years old, seated in a wheelchair, wheeling herself carefully down the center aisle, her family walking quietly beside her.
Maddie's breath catches the moment she recognizes her. Casey Reeves stops directly in front of the stage, looking up at Richard Whitfield, then turning instead to face the crowd, finding Maddie's eyes among the sea of stunned faces. 5 years ago, Casey says, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly trembling underneath it. I was injured during a completely legal, completely accidental moment in a martial arts competition against my closest friend, Madison Cole. The crowd falls utterly silent, hanging on every word.
She has spent 5 years believing that accident was her fault, Casey continues. She quit the sport she loved. She stopped defending herself even when she desperately needed to because she was so afraid of ever hurting anyone again. That is not the profile of someone dangerous. That is the profile of someone with more conscience than almost anyone I have ever known.
Casey pauses, tears now slipping freely down her cheeks. A few days ago, she continues, I found out this same young woman finally stepped in to protect a friend from real harm, using exactly as much force as the moment required, and not 1 ounce more. And instead of being thanked for it, she was suspended, while the person responsible for the actual violence stood here today about to be celebrated.
She turns fully toward Maddie, now her voice softening.
Maddie, she says,
it was never your fault. It was never, ever your fault. I have spent 5 years hoping I'd get the chance to tell you that in person. I'm so glad it finally happened here, in front of everyone who needed to hear it too. Maddie, tears streaming freely down her own face now, moves through the stunned crowd toward her old friend, kneeling down beside the wheelchair, wrapping her arms around Casey in an embrace 5 years overdue.
The quad remains hushed for a long suspended moment, the only sound the soft rustle of wind through the surrounding trees, string of ceremonial flags fluttering gently overhead. Then, slowly, the crowd begins to applaud. Not for Richard Whitfield, not for the gleaming new building behind him, but for the quiet, extraordinary courage standing in the center of that aisle. Dr. Eleanor Bird steps forward to the podium herself now, her expression firm and resolute.
This ceremony is postponed, she announces clearly, pending a full and immediate investigation into everything we have just witnessed here today. I want to personally thank Mrs. Marsh, Mr. Finch, Mr. Higgins, Miss Turner, and Miss Reeves for their extraordinary courage in coming forward.
She turns briefly toward Richard Whitfield, who stands frozen near the edge of the stage, security personnel now quietly moving to flank him rather than protect him.
Mr. Whitfield, she says, I believe you and your son have some serious questions to answer, likely to more than just this college. The senator, without a word, quietly gathers his aides and departs the stage entirely, clearly unwilling to remain associated with the unfolding scandal even a moment longer.
Brody Whitfield stands utterly alone now at the center of the stage. The crowd's collective gaze, once so eager to celebrate him, now fixed on him with an entirely different kind of attention. He looks, for the first time in his life, genuinely, deeply afraid. Let's step back from the chaos of that stage for a moment and return instead to the quiet aftermath unfolding at the edge of the crowd. Maddie sits on the grass beside Casey's wheelchair, both of them still holding hands tightly. 5 years of unspoken grief finally beginning gently, painfully, to heal. Nora kneels beside them, one arm wrapped supportively around Maddie's shoulders. Frank stands nearby, watching his granddaughter with an expression of quiet, overwhelming pride. Tears he does not bother hiding slipping freely down his weathered cheeks. Diane Hale approaches slowly, kneeling down as well, resting a gentle hand on Maddie's shoulder. Your mother would be so proud of you, she says softly. Not for what you did in that courtyard or on that quad, for everything you chose not to do, for 5 long years, until the exact moment it finally mattered most. Maddie looks up at her, voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank all of you. Any of you. You don't need to thank us, Walt says, joining the small circle gathering around her. This town owed your mother a debt it never got the chance to properly repay. Today, we finally started paying a little of it back. Around them, the crowd slowly begins to disperse, though small groups linger, elderly men and women embracing one another, quietly sharing stories about Sarah Cole that have waited years, sometimes decades, to finally be spoken aloud in the light of day. Ruth Adler makes her way over, eventually pulling Maddie into a fierce, motherly hug. "Your job's waiting for you Monday morning," she says firmly. "Whole town's going to want pie and coffee after a day like today." Maddie laughs through her tears, the sound surprising even herself, light and genuine in a way it has not been in longer than she can remember. As the afternoon sun begins its slow descent toward evening, casting long golden light across the quad, Frank kneels down beside his granddaughter one final time, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulls out the bracelet. Freshly cleaned, carefully mended, the stitching along the torn thread now reinforced with new material, sturdy enough to last another generation. "I fixed the rest of it properly this week," he says softly, voice rough with emotion. "Figured today might be the right day to give it back to you the way it deserves." He gently ties it around her wrist fingers, trembling slightly with age and feeling both. Maddie looks down at the familiar words stitched into the fabric. "Patience is not weakness." "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispers. "Thank your mother," Frank says softly. "She's the one who taught all of us what those words really mean." Around them, the small circle of people who love her, old and young, battle-worn and newly healed, stand together quietly in the fading golden light. The ruined ceremony behind them transformed into something far more meaningful than any ribbon-cutting ever could have been. In the days that follow, the full story spreads far beyond Wentworth Falls. Local news coverage turns into regional coverage, then briefly into a small national story, though the attention fades within a couple weeks, the way these things often do. Richard Whitfield resigns from the college's Board of Trustees within 72 hours, facing mounting legal scrutiny into both the land fraud allegations and the cover-up surrounding Ashley Turner's case. Brody Whitfield is formally expelled from Wentworth College less than a week later, facing separate legal proceedings of his own that will likely follow him for years to come. Vice President Whitcomb resigns quietly, citing personal reasons, though few on campus are fooled by the explanation. Maddie's suspension is reversed immediately, her academic record fully restored, along with a formal public apology from the college's administration. Brody's complaint against her, once quietly reviewed against the nurse's own original notes, is formally withdrawn and struck from her file entirely. The half-built athletic complex sits unfinished for months afterward, its future uncertain, though Dr. Bird announces plans several weeks later to eventually complete the building under a very different name entirely: the Sarah Cole Community Wellness Center. A place, the announcement explains, that will offer free self-defense classes, physical therapy, support, and community outreach programs permanently funded through a newly established scholarship endowment bearing her name. Maddie cries when she reads the announcement, sitting on the same dormitory steps where weeks earlier she once sat alone in the cold October night, wondering if the truth would ever find its way to the surface. It did. It simply needed patience and the quiet, steady courage of an entire community willing to finally stand up together. As for Maddie herself, something shifts within her in the weeks following Founders Day. She begins training again, slowly, carefully, not for competition, not for any trophy or title, but simply for herself, and for the quiet, healing joy of movement she had denied herself for far too long. Diane Hale becomes something between a mentor and a friend, the two of them training together some evenings in the gymnasium, filling that space once again with the same patient, purposeful energy Sarah Cole once brought to it herself. One evening in late November, as the first real snow of the season begins to dust the campus, Diane asks Maddie a question she has been holding on to for weeks. "Have you ever thought about teaching?" Diane asks, watching Maddie work slowly through a series of forms she has not practiced in years. "Not competing, just teaching. The way your mother did?" Maddie pauses, considering the question seriously for the first time. "I used to think I'd lost the right to that,"
she admits. Like something that happened to Casey meant I didn't get to pass any of it forward anymore.
And now? Diane asks gently.
Maddie looks down at her hands, then out the frosted gymnasium window toward the quiet, snow-dusted quad beyond it. Now I think maybe that's exactly why I should, she says slowly. Because I understand something about carrying that weight responsibly that I never would have understood if I hadn't lost my way with it first.
Diane smiles, something quietly proud settling across her weathered features. Your mother used to say something almost exactly like that, she says, about how the best teachers are rarely the ones who never stumbled. They're the ones who learned the hard way exactly how much a single moment of carelessness can cost, and who carry that lesson gently into every single class after. By early spring, Maddie has begun assisting with a small evening class at Frank's old gym on Maple Street, working alongside her grandfather, teaching basic self-defense techniques to a mixed group of college students and Wentworth Falls residents alike, several of them well into their 60s and 70s. Ruth Adler is among her most devoted students, insisting with a stubborn grin that a woman her age has every right to learn how to throw a proper hip check if the situation ever calls for it. Casey Reeves visits often in the months that follow their friendship, slowly, tenderly rebuilding itself into something even stronger than it was before, unburdened at last by 5 years of unnecessary guilt. On one particularly warm afternoon in early spring, Casey watches from the sideline of Frank's gym as Maddie gently corrects a young student's stance, patient and encouraging, in exactly the way her mother once was. You know, Casey says afterward, as they sit together outside on the gym's front steps, sunlight warm against their faces. Watching you teach today, for just a second there, I could have sworn I was watching your mom.
Maddie's eyes fill with tears, though this time they come easily, gently, without the sharp edge of grief that once accompanied every memory of Sarah Cole.
I think that might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me, she says softly.
Good, Casey says, bumping her shoulder gently against Maddie's. Because it's true. And on quiet evenings, when her shift at the diner finally ends, Maddie sometimes finds herself walking the familiar path back to campus beneath a sky full of early winter stars, the mended bracelet resting gently against her wrist. Her mother's words settled deep and permanent within her heart.
Patience is not weakness. It never was. It was simply strength waiting quietly for exactly the right moment to finally stand up and be seen. Let's take one final look back at Wentworth Falls before we close this story, because there was a small, quiet ceremony held the following autumn that deserves mention, though it draws none of the fanfare, none of the news cameras, none of the carefully staged banners that once hung over that half-finished building on the edge of campus. The Sarah Cole Community Wellness Center opens its doors exactly 1 year after the events of that Founder's Day, on a cool October morning nearly identical to the one that began this story. There is no ribbon-cutting ceremony with a visiting senator, no expensive banner, no polished speeches designed for cameras. Instead, there is simply a modest gathering on the front lawn, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, Frank Cole standing beside his granddaughter, Walt and Diane and Ruth and Nora and Casey, scattered comfortably among dozens of familiar faces, many of them the very same men and women who once stood up together in that quad, refusing to let silence win one more time. Dr. Eleanor Bird says a few brief words, then she turns the small microphone over to Maddie. Maddie stands quietly for a moment, looking out over the gathered crowd, the same mended bracelet catching the morning light on her wrist. My mother used to tell her students that courage is quiet more often than it's loud, she says finally, her voice carrying clearly across the small crowd. That the strongest people rarely need to raise their voice to prove it. She pauses, glancing toward her grandfather, who nods encouragingly. I spent a long time believing strength meant staying silent, no matter what, Maddie continues. It took an entire town standing up together to finally teach me the rest of that lesson. That sometimes the truest strength isn't staying silent at all. It's knowing exactly when silence has done all the good it possibly can, and choosing carefully, deliberately, to finally speak.
She looks out over the crowd one final time, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. "Thank you all," she says softly, "for teaching me that, when I needed it most." The small crowd applauds warmly, and somewhere in that gentle, unassuming moment beneath an ordinary autumn sky in a small town most people will never think twice about, something quietly, permanently comes full circle. Thank you for spending this story with us. If it moved you even just a little, we hope you'll carry a piece of it forward. Because somewhere out there, someone quiet, someone underestimated, someone carrying more strength than the world has ever bothered to notice, might just need a reminder today that patience was never weakness, and that the truth, however long it takes, always finds its way home. Wentworth Falls goes on the way small towns always do, seasons turning over, one after another, the maple trees along Main Street losing their leaves and growing them back, the diner's pie case restocked every morning like clockwork. But something in the town feels different now, quieter, in a good way, steadier. The way a house feels once a long overdue repair has finally been made. People still stop Frank Cole on the sidewalk sometimes just to shake his hand. People still bring Ruth Adler homemade preserves in exchange for a slice of pie and a few minutes of conversation. And on Tuesday evenings, if you walk past the little gym on Maple Street, you can hear a young woman's voice through the windows, patient and warm, telling a room full of strangers that they are stronger than they think. That is where we leave them. Not with a grand finale, but with something better. An ordinary Tuesday evening in an ordinary town where an extraordinary woman's legacy quietly continues one lesson at a time.